In the lively city of Nakuruya, Layla thought she had found the kind of love that lasts forever. When Kamari came into her life, he swept her off her feet with his charm and big dreams. He always spoke of building an empire together, of making a future so bright that nothing could break them apart. Layla believed every word, because in his eyes she saw the promise of loyalty and in his smile she felt safe. Their wedding was filled with laughter, music and blessings from everyone who loved them. People said they were the perfect couple, the kind who would inspire others. And Layla, dressed in her shining gown, truly believed she was stepping into a life of joy and partnership. She gave her heart to him fully, trusting that his promises were real. In those early days, every gesture felt like love, every whisper felt like destiny. She imagined children, a home built with laughter, and a man who would stand beside her in every storm. She couldn't have known then that the same man who held her hand so tightly that night would one day let it go so easily. For her, it all began with love and hope. Soon after the wedding, Layla began to notice little changes in Kamari that slowly broke her heart. The sweet man who once praised her smile and encouraged her dreams now seemed annoyed by her very presence. At first it was in small ways. He would laugh whenever she shared an idea, brushing it aside as if it was silly. When she tried to talk about her plans or the things she wanted to do with her life, he would interrupt her saying, "Leave these things to me. You wouldn't understand." His words stung, but she told herself it was just stress, that maybe marriage had put pressure on him. But the more time passed, the clearer it became that this wasn't just stress, it was who he really was. He started mocking her in front of others, calling her too soft or too slow to understand serious matters. When friends came over, he treated her like she was invisible, talking over her or making jokes at her expense while everyone laughed. Layla would force a smile, but inside she felt smaller and smaller. She was no longer the partner he once promised to build with. She was being treated like a shadow in her own marriage. What hurt most was not just the disrespect but the way he seemed proud of it. He wanted to show the world that he was the one in control, the one with power. Sometimes, when she stayed quiet to avoid conflict, he would smirk and say, "See, even she knows her place." Those words cut deeper than any argument could. Layla would lie awake at night replaying his insults in her head, wondering if maybe she was the problem. But deep down, a quiet voice inside her whispered that she deserved more. She wasn't just a shadow, and though he tried to make her small, something within her was slowly gathering strength, waiting for the right moment to rise. Would you like me to continue writing the next parts 3, 4, 5? In the same flowing, detailed style so you'll have the full emotional story ready? While Kamari spent his nights snoring peacefully, Layla was quietly fighting for her future. She would slip out of bed when the house was silent, her heart heavy with the pain of his words, but her spirit refusing to give up. At the small wooden desk by the window, with only a dim lamp to light her papers, she began teaching herself skills that no one knew she was learning. She read articles, watched tutorials, and took online courses in business and design. Every night, when most of the city slept, she stayed awake, determined to create something that belonged only to her. First, it was just small things. She learned how to sell handmade crafts online, then how to connect with customers beyond Nakuruya. Orders trickled in, just a few at a time, but each one felt like a small victory, a reminder that she was more than the useless woman Kamari called her. With every sale, her confidence grew. She began expanding, learning about marketing, networking with people from other countries, and slowly building a brand that carried her name. Kamari never suspected a thing. To him, she was still the quiet wife who didn't understand life. When he left the house laughing with his friends or stayed out late, she used that time to work harder. She saved every coin she earned, reinvested her profits, and built a business account that he had no clue existed. It was her secret world, a place where his insults could not reach her, where she could dream freely without fear of being mocked. Sometimes her eyes would grow heavy, her body tired, but she reminded herself of the pain of his disrespect, and that pain became fuel. She whispered to herself, "One day this will all make sense. One day I'll rise." What Kamari saw as weakness was actually the quiet birth of her strength, and though he mocked her in the daylight, Layla was building her empire in the dark. Do you want me to keep going with part 4, the betrayal that cut deep, in the same detailed emotional style? The nights that Layla spent building her secret future were the same nights Kamari wasted destroying the love they once had. Instead of being a husband who stood by her, he began slipping away into the arms of other women. He thought she didn't know, but the whispers in Nakuruya always found their way back to her. Friends avoided her eyes, neighbors shook their heads, and sometimes she could smell unfamiliar perfume on his clothes when he returned home. Each discovery was like a knife twisting in her chest, but she learned to hide her pain behind silence. What made it worse wasn't just the betrayal of his body, but the betrayal of his words. Kamari bragged to his friends about how useless his wife was, how she was just a burden who knew nothing about life. In the taverns of Mwanzia and the crowded streets of the city, he laughed at her expense, never knowing she was at home building something far greater than his shallow pride. His friends laughed with him, but when they saw Layla, some lowered their eyes in shame, for even they could sense the cruelty in his boasting. There were nights when she wanted to confront him, to scream, to demand why the man who once promised her forever had turned into a stranger. But then she would sit at her desk, open her laptop, and remind herself that revenge was not in words, it was in results. Instead of breaking, she poured her tears into her work, each contract signed and every coin earned becoming her quiet answer to his betrayal. And still he never noticed. He thought her silence was weakness, that her calm acceptance meant she had surrendered. What he didn't realize was that her silence was strategy, and her calmness was power. While he wasted his nights chasing temporary pleasures, Layla was building a kingdom he would never be part of. His betrayal cut her deeply, but it also sharpened her spirit. In those moments of heartbreak, she learned something that would change her life forever. Sometimes the deepest wounds. One quiet morning as the sun spilled through the curtains, Kamari sat at the dining table with a look of triumph on his face. He held a stack of papers in his hand, his lips curled into a cruel smile. Without hesitation, he slid them across to Layla. His voice dripped with arrogance as he said, "Sign these. You'll be nothing without me." The words hit her like a slap, but she didn't let her tears show. She looked at the papers, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. This was the man she once trusted with her heart, the man who once whispered promises of forever, now looking at her like she was nothing more than a burden he wanted to discard. Kamari leaned back in his chair, smirking, convinced he had won. To him, she was just a helpless woman who couldn't survive without his money, his name or his presence. He believed that once she signed, her life would crumble, and he would walk away victorious. What he didn't know was that the woman sitting across from him was no longer the same Layla, who had once begged for his affection. She had grown in silence, built her strength in the shadows, and created a life he knew nothing about. Layla's heart ached, but deep inside a quiet fire burned. She thought of the nights she had stayed awake working, the contracts she had signed, the clients who trusted her, and the bank accounts that grew fuller with every passing month. He thought he was pushing her into darkness, but in reality he was setting her free. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. She simply picked up the pen, her face calm, her silence powerful. Kamari mistook it for defeat, chuckling to himself as he imagined her struggling alone. But as she signed her name, Layla knew something he didn't. This signature was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of his downfall. Would you like me to go on with part 6? The laughter in the courtroom in the same deep emotional flow? The day of the hearing finally came, and the grand courthouse of Mwanzia was filled with echoes of footsteps and murmurs of curious onlookers. Kamari arrived dressed in his finest suit, his head held high, laughter spilling from his mouth as though he had already won. His friends walked in with him, clapping him on the back, joking loudly about how he was about to teach his wife a lesson. To them it was entertainment, a show where Kamari would walk out victorious while Layla was left in shame. As he stood at the steps of the courthouse, he laughed so loudly that people turned to look. He wanted everyone to see him, to see his confidence, to see how sure he was that this day belonged to him. To Kamari, this was not just a divorce. It was his chance to prove to the world that Layla was nothing without him. But Layla entered quietly, her deep green traditional attire flowing gracefully as she walked. She did not need to laugh or make noise. Her silence carried a weight that no one could ignore. While Kamari joked with his friends, she kept her gaze steady, her steps firm, her spirit calm. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Kamari leaned back in his seat, arms folded, still chuckling as if the judge's presence meant nothing. He whispered little comments to his friends, mocking Layla, making them stifle laughter as though they were in on some great joke. Every time he glanced at her, he smirked, convinced she was too weak to fight, too empty-handed to matter. But while he laughed, Layla sat tall and composed, her hands folded neatly on her lap. She wasn't there to argue or to beg. She was there to let the truth speak for itself. And though Kamari thought he had already won, the walls of that courtroom were about to echo with something that would wipe the smile from his face forever. Would you like me to carry on with Part 7? The judge's calm warning in the same powerful storytelling style? The judge entered the courtroom with quiet authority, and the room immediately fell silent. Everyone rose as he took his seat, his calm eyes moving between Kamari and Layla. After a brief pause, his voice rang out, steady, measured, and gentle, yet carrying a weight that made every ear listen closely. Today, he began, we will not only settle the matter of your marriage, but also the matter of your wealth and contributions. At those words, Layla's heart remained steady, but Kamari leaned back with a smirk spreading across his face. To him it was a joke. He believed wealth was a conversation he had already won. He thought of his flashy cars, his loud friends, and the pride he wore like a crown. He glanced at Layla with mock pity and whispered to one of his companions, "What wealth? She has nothing. This will be over quickly." His friends stifled laughter, their arrogance echoing his own. But the judge's calm tone carried a deeper meaning. Marriage, he continued, is not just about love. It is also about what is built, what is invested, and what remains after trust is broken. Both of you will stand on equal ground here. The statement hung in the air, unsettling some in the room. People turned their eyes toward Layla, who sat with quiet dignity, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze unwavering. Kamari, however, remained blind. He mistook the warning for reassurance, convinced that the law would favor him, the man who looked stronger, louder, richer. He smirked again, almost amused, believing the judge's words were a formality. He had no idea that those calm sentences were the storm clouds before the thunder. As the judge organized the documents and prepared to reveal the truth, the silence in the room thickened. It was the kind of silence that carried anticipation, the kind that warned a proud man his confidence was about to shatter. Kamari didn't see it, but everyone else could feel it. His laughter was about to die on his lips. "Do you want me?" The courtroom grew still as the judge picked up a thick folder of documents. His voice was calm, but every word carried the weight of truth. According to the financial records submitted, he began, Mrs. Layla owns several business accounts under her name. He paused, letting the words sink in. Murmurs swept through the room, but Kamari only frowned, still convinced it was a mistake. The judge continued, his tone steady and unshaken. These accounts include international contracts, steady partnerships with companies overseas, and investments that have grown into the millions. Each sentence struck Kamari like a hammer. His smirk began to tremble, his jaw tightening as if the words themselves burned. He leaned forward, his laughter gone, his eyes wide in disbelief. The crowd shifted, whispers spreading like wildfire. People who once pitied Layla now stared at her with awe. The quiet woman they thought was living in her husband's shadow was revealed as a builder, a leader, a woman of strength and intelligence. Even Kamari's friends, who had entered the courtroom laughing, now sat in stunned silence, avoiding his eyes. Kamari shook his head violently, his voice breaking as he muttered, "No, this can't be true." He tried to rise, but the judge silenced him with a firm glance. "These records are verified," the judge said firmly. "Mrs. Layla's success is not an illusion. It is documented, legal, and undeniable." Layla sat quietly, her face calm, her posture regal. She did not need to gloat or explain. The truth was being spoken for her. Her silence, once mocked, now roared louder than his arrogance ever had. Kamari's confidence melted into horror. The man who thought he was untouchable now looked small and desperate. Each word from the judge was another piece of proof that Layla was not only strong, she was far beyond anything he ever imagined. By the time the judge finished reading, the entire courtroom knew the truth. The man who laughed was nothing, and the moment the judge finished reading Layla's financial records, the courtroom erupted into a storm of whispers. People leaned toward one another, eyes wide, voices hushed but urgent. It was as though the air itself had changed, carrying the weight of a truth no one had expected. The woman they once thought of as the silent, invisible wife was suddenly the center of admiration and respect. Kamari's friends, who had marched into the courthouse laughing loudly at his side, now sat frozen. Their smiles had vanished, replaced by stunned expressions. Some avoided his gaze, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but all of them stared at Layla with new eyes. They had mocked her for years, laughed at her quietness, believed every cruel word Kamari spoke about her. But now they were forced to face the truth. The woman they ignored was wealthier and more powerful than any of them had ever imagined. One of them whispered, "Did you hear that? International contracts." Another muttered under his breath, "Millions? She's richer than all of us combined." Their awe filled the room, and their shame weighed heavy. They could not even look at Kamari, who sat stiff, his face pale, his once arrogant smile completely gone. Layla, however, did not move. She sat with grace, her chin slightly lifted, her eyes calm and steady. She didn't need to respond to the gasps or the whispers. Her silence spoke louder than any speech could. In that moment, she was not just a wife in a courtroom. She was a queen sitting on a throne, commanding respect without demanding it. Every whisper, every gasp was like music to her ears, not because she wanted revenge, but because she had finally been seen for who she truly was. The same silence that Kamari had once mocked now wrapped around her like a crown. And in that courtroom, before friends, strangers, and the law, the truth was undeniable. The quiet wife was never weak, she was extraordinary. "Would you like me to now move forward with?" Kamari's face turned pale as the judge's words echoed through the courtroom. The man who had walked in with laughter and arrogance now sat trembling, his confidence shattered. He tried to speak, his voice breaking as he stammered, This can't be right. She couldn't have done all this without me." His words sounded desperate, weak, nothing like the proud man who had mocked his wife just hours before. The judge, however, remained calm and firm. "Mr. Kamari," he said, his tone steady, "you signed these divorce papers willingly. The law does not favor arrogance or empty pride. It favors evidence. It favors truth. And here the truth is clear. She built this wealth, not you." His voice carried across the room, silencing every murmur, making Kamari shrink deeper into his seat. Kamari's eyes darted around the courtroom, searching for support, for a friendly face to defend him. But his friends, who had once cheered him on, refused to meet his gaze. Some looked away in shame, others sat in stunned silence, unwilling to be associated with his downfall. He looked at Layla, hoping to find some trace of pity in her eyes, but all he saw was calm strength. She did not gloat. She did not even smile. Her quiet dignity was sharper than any revenge. "No," he muttered again, his voice cracking. "This isn't fair." But the judge cut him off with one final statement. "Fairness belongs to those who respect, not to those who mock. You chose laughter at her expense. Today the law chooses justice at hers." The room remained still, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Kamari's desperate eyes, once filled with pride, now showed only fear and regret. He realized too late that he had laughed himself into his own downfall. The woman he had underestimated had risen higher than he could ever reach. "Do you want me to continue with part 11? The moment of victory?" Capturing Layla's powerful dignity at the climax of the courtroom scene? Layla rose slowly from her seat, her movements calm and graceful, as though she had been preparing for this moment all her life. The deep green folds of her traditional attire flowed around her like a queen's robe, catching the light of the courtroom and making her presence impossible to ignore. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her silence carried the weight of every sleepless night, every insult swallowed, every tear shed in the dark. It was more powerful than 1,000 speeches. All eyes turned toward her. The same people who once pitied her now looked at her with awe. They saw not just a wife, not just a woman wronged, but a figure of strength, dignity, and triumph. Even the judge paused for a moment, as if giving space for her quiet victory to settle into the walls of the room. Kamari's eyes followed her every step, filled with disbelief. He had expected her to beg, to cry, to fall apart in front of everyone. Instead, she stood taller than he had ever seen, her head high, her shoulders steady, her face glowing with the kind of confidence that could not be faked. For the first time, he understood that he had lost. Not just the marriage, not just the wealth, but the power he thought he had over her. The room was silent except for the faint rustle of her attire as she moved. She didn't look at Kamari with anger or revenge, only with calm certainty. as though he was no longer important enough to deserve her emotions. That, more than anything, broke him. Her victory was not in money, not in contracts or investments. It was in the way she carried herself, the way she turned humiliation into power, the way she walked away without needing to prove anything to anyone. In that courtroom, Layla didn't just win a case. She reclaimed herself, and her silence declared it louder than words ever could. Shall I move on with part 12? The fall of his pride, showing how Kamari walks out broken in front of the same friends who once cheered him? Kamari walked out of the courtroom with his head lowered, his once proud steps now heavy and unsteady. The same man who had strutted in earlier, laughing loudly and boasting to his friends, now looked like a shadow of himself. His suit no longer seemed sharp. It hung on him like a burden. His smile, once wide and arrogant, had completely vanished. All that remained was the hollow look of a man whose pride had been shattered in front of everyone. His friends followed behind him, but they no longer clapped him on the back or cheered him on. Their silence was louder than their earlier laughter. Some whispered quietly to each other, avoiding his eyes, ashamed of the way they had mocked Layla alongside him. Others walked a little further away, not wanting to be seen too close to his humiliation. The same men who once laughed at his cruel jokes about his wife now looked at her with respect and at him with pity. Every step he took outside the courthouse felt like a punishment. People who had gathered there whispered as he passed, some shaking their heads, others staring openly at the man who had fallen so low. He could feel the sting of their eyes on him, feel the shame pressing into his skin. He had wanted this day to prove his power, but instead it revealed his weakness to the whole city. Kamari glanced back once, his desperate eyes searching for Layla, but she didn't look his way. She walked in the opposite direction, her steps steady, her head held high, her dignity untouched. That final image broke him more than the judge's words or the whispers of the crowd. For years, he had made her the subject of his jokes. Now he was the lesson. His pride had carried him into that courtroom like a king, but he left it like a beggar, stripped of everything he thought made him strong. Do you want me to continue with part 13? The woman who rose alone, showing how Layla embraces her freedom and power after this turning point? That night, when the noise of the city had quieted and the stars hung over Nakuruya, Layla walked into the one place that had always given her strength, her office. It was a simple room, but to her it was a palace. The walls were covered with maps marking the countries she now worked with, charts showing her steady growth, and shelves stacked with folders of contracts she had signed in silence. Her laptop glowed softly on the desk, filled with new messages from partners around the world. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, her eyes filling with tears, not of pain this time but of pride. She walked slowly to her chair and sat down, letting her hands glide over the papers spread across the desk. Every line of ink, every signature, every agreement was a reminder of her journey. No one had helped her, no one had carried her. Especially not Kamari. He had laughed, he had mocked, he had betrayed, but none of that had stopped her. Instead, his disrespect became the fire that pushed her forward. Every insult had been fuel. Every lonely night had been a step toward this freedom. As she leaned back in her chair, she thought of the woman she used to be, quiet, eager to please, waiting for his approval. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, wiser, and free. She realized she had built her entire world without him, and in that truth came a powerful peace. A smile spread across her face, gentle yet fierce. For the first time in years, her smile belonged only to her. She wasn't smiling to hide pain or to please anyone. She was smiling because she had survived, and she had won. In that quiet room, surrounded by the empire she created, Layla felt lighter than ever before. She had risen alone, and in her freedom she finally saw her worth. Do you want me to now continue with part 14? The lesson that spread, where her story becomes the talk of the entire city and a source of inspiration for other women. News of what happened in the courtroom spread through Nakuruya faster than fire on dry grass. By the next morning, everyone was talking about Layla. In the markets, women leaned close to each other, whispering her story while weighing vegetables. In the salons, it was repeated between the hum of hair dryers and the scent of perfume. At tea stalls, her name floated in the air like a warning and a blessing at the same time. Never underestimate a woman's silence, they said softly. It hides storms you cannot imagine. The story struck a chord because so many women saw themselves in her. They knew what it meant to stay quiet while carrying the weight of pain. They understood the strength it took to build dreams in secret, unnoticed and unappreciated. Layla became more than just one woman. She became a mirror for all of them. She showed that silence is not always weakness, that dignity can be more powerful than anger, and that betrayal doesn't have to break a woman, it can build her. Even young girls heard about her and repeated her story in schools, their eyes wide with admiration. They spoke of her as if she were a queen, a woman who turned humiliation into victory without shouting, without begging, without revenge. Men too heard the tale, and some grew uneasy, realizing that mocking or dismissing a woman might one day leave them in the same disgrace Kamari faced. In the evenings, when the city lights glowed and the streets buzzed with voices, Layla's name was on people's lips. Not as gossip but as a lesson. She had walked into court with quiet dignity and walked out with power, and that became a story worth telling again and again. In Nakaruya, her story turned into a proverb, a reminder passed down from one woman to another. Respect her silence, because you never know what it carries inside. Would you like me to carry this into part 15? The woman who owned her crown, where Layla embraces her strength fully and the city sees her as a symbol of power. For the first time in many years, Layla's smile was real. It wasn't the forced smile she used to wear to hide her pain, nor the empty one she gave to keep peace in her home. This time it was calm, pure, and filled with peace. She sat by her window as the evening sun painted the sky gold, and she felt a freedom she had almost forgotten existed. The laughter that once tore her apart, the cruel jokes, the mocking whispers was gone. What remained was the strength she had built in silence, the power that no one had seen coming. Across Nakaruya, people still spoke about her. They admired how she carried herself without anger or bitterness. Her quiet dignity had become louder than any revenge could ever be. Women saw her as a symbol of hope, and men remembered her story as a warning. But for Layla, it wasn't about them anymore. It was about her, her freedom, her peace, her journey. She walked through her home and looked at everything she had built. The office, the charts, the contracts. All of it was a reminder that she had survived on her own terms. When she caught her reflection in the mirror, she saw not the fragile bride she once was, but a woman who had risen above betrayal and turned pain into power. She touched her face gently and smiled again. A smile that carried victory, healing, and freedom all at once. Do you want me to now weave all 15 parts together into one complete flowing story, so it reads like a powerful viral tale from start to finish?